Sarah Martinez walked through the crowded shopping mall with her head held high, despite the whispers that followed her wherever she went. At 38, she carried herself with the posture of someone who had once commanded respect, but now found herself the subject of cruel gossip in their small military town of Fort Carson, Colorado. Her left leg dragged slightly as she moved, a permanent reminder of the explosion that had changed everything 3 years ago. The prosthetic beneath her jeans was state-of-the-art, but it couldn't hide the fact that her once perfect military bearing had been forever altered. Children stared openly while their parents quickly pulled them away, embarrassed by their curiosity, but unable to hide their own uncomfortable glances. "Look, there goes the washed-up soldier," she heard a woman whisper to her friend as they passed the coffee shop. "I heard she used to think she was some kind of war hero. Now look at her." Sarah's jaw tightened, but she didn't turn around. She had learned to let such comments roll off her back, though each one still stung more than she cared to admit. The truth was far more complicated than these people could ever imagine, but she had long since stopped trying to defend herself. Some secrets were too dangerous to share, even to restore her reputation. She made her way to the military surplus store at the far end of the mall, one of the few places where she felt somewhat at peace. The owner, Jim Rodriguez, was a Vietnam veteran who treated her with the respect she rarely received elsewhere. His store was filled with authentic military gear, old uniforms, and memorabilia that brought back memories of better times. "Afternoon, Sarah," Jim called out as she entered. "How are you holding up today?" "Same as always," she replied with a tired smile. "Just picking up some supplies." Jim nodded knowingly. He was one of the few people in town who didn't judge her based on the gossip and rumors that had spread like wildfire after her medical discharge. He had seen enough broken soldiers in his lifetime to recognize the difference between someone who had given up and someone who was simply carrying invisible wounds. As Sarah browsed the aisles, she overheard a group of young men near the tactical gear section making jokes about fake soldiers and wannabe heroes. Their voices grew louder as they noticed her presence, clearly intending for her to hear their mockery. "I bet she never even saw real combat," one of them said loudly. "Probably just got hurt during basic training and milked it for attention." Another laughed cruelly. "Yeah, I heard she tells everyone she was special forces or something. Like they'd ever let a woman into the real dangerous stuff." Sarah's hands clenched into fists at her sides, but she forced herself to keep walking. These young men had no idea what she had sacrificed, what she had seen, or what she had done in service to her country. But her story was classified at levels so high that even mentioning certain details could land her in federal prison. The truth was that Staff Sergeant Sarah Martinez had been one of the most highly trained operatives in the United States military. She had spent 8 years as part of an elite unit that officially didn't exist, carrying out missions in places that never appeared on any government reports. Her specialty had been deep reconnaissance and extraction operations in hostile territories where conventional forces couldn't operate. But none of that mattered now. The explosion that had taken her leg had also taken her career, her identity, and apparently her dignity in the eyes of her community. The military had given her a generous disability pension and a chest full of medals she couldn't display publicly, but they couldn't give her back the respect she had once commanded. As she reached for a tactical flashlight on a high shelf, her balance shifted and she stumbled slightly. The group of young men burst into laughter, making exaggerated limping motions and pretending to fall over each other. "Careful there, hero," one of them called out mockingly. "Wouldn't want you to hurt yourself reaching for that flashlight." Jim Rodriguez appeared beside them so quickly that they didn't have time to react. His weathered face was set in a hard expression that spoke of decades of military discipline and zero tolerance for disrespect. "I think you boys need to find somewhere else to shop," he said in a voice that brooked no argument. "This is a store for people who actually respect the uniform." The young men tried to protest, but Jim's steady gaze and the presence of several other veterans who frequented his store convinced them to leave without further incident. Sarah watched them go, grateful for Jim's intervention, but hating that she needed defending. "Don't let them get to you," Jim said quietly as he helped her reach the flashlight. "Most people in this town have no idea what real service looks like." Sarah nodded, but the encounter had stirred up emotions she tried to keep buried. The frustration of being unable to defend herself, the anger at being reduced to a figure of pity and mockery, and the deep sadness of losing everything she had worked so hard to achieve. After completing her purchases, Sarah made her way home to the small apartment she rented on the outskirts of town. The space was spartanly furnished, reflecting both her military background and her reduced circumstances. The walls were bare except for a single framed photograph of her army unit, though even that photo had been carefully edited to remove any identifying insignia or background details that might reveal too much. Her phone buzzed with a text message from her sister, Maria, who lived 3 states away. "Saw your interview request got denied again. I'm sorry, sis. Maybe it's time to consider moving somewhere new." Sarah stared at the message for a long time before responding. For months, she had been trying to get permission to speak with a journalist about her experiences, hoping that sharing even a sanitized version of her story might help restore some dignity to her life. But every request was met with the same response: classified information, national security concerns, ongoing operations that might be compromised. She understood the reasoning, but it didn't make her situation any easier to bear. She was trapped in a peculiar form of purgatory, unable to defend herself against the accusations and mockery while sitting on a story that would probably earn her a book deal and movie rights if she could tell it. The evening news droned on in the background as she prepared a simple dinner. The lead story was about a local charity event organized by the mayor's wife, featuring testimonials from real heroes who had served their country with distinction. Sarah watched with bitter irony as the reporter interviewed soldiers whose service, while honorable, paled in comparison to what she had done in the shadows. Her laptop chimed with an email notification. The sender was listed simply as DoD Classification Review, and Sarah's heart rate quickened as she opened it. These emails were rare, usually containing updates about the status of her various requests to declassify portions of her service record. The message was brief and to the point: request denied. Previous determination stands. No further appeals will be considered at this time. Sarah closed the laptop and leaned back in her chair, feeling the weight of her isolation more acutely than usual. She thought about Maria's suggestion to move away, to start fresh somewhere where no one knew her story or lack thereof. It was tempting, but Fort Carson was the only home she had known since leaving the military. Despite the whispers and the mockery, this place still felt like where she belonged. The next morning brought another day of the same routine. Sarah had developed a strict schedule to give structure to her days, starting with physical therapy exercises that kept her prosthetic functioning properly and maintained what remained of her combat readiness. Old habits died hard, and she still maintained the fitness standards she had held during her active service. At the grocery store, she encountered Mrs. Patterson, an elderly woman whose grandson had recently joined the army. Mrs. Patterson had always been kind to Sarah, though she clearly believed the rumors about her exaggerated service claims. "How are you doing, dear?" Mrs. Patterson asked with the sort of patronizing sympathy reserved for people considered to be struggling with delusions. "My grandson Tommy is about to finish basic training. I keep telling him to be careful not to get carried away with military fantasies like some people do." The comment was delivered with a sweet smile, but its meaning was unmistakable. Sarah managed a polite response and quickly finished her shopping, adding another small wound to the collection she carried. As she walked home, Sarah reflected on the cruel irony of her situation. She had spent years risking her life in situations that most people couldn't imagine, making split-second decisions that had saved American lives and prevented terrorist attacks that never made the news precisely because they had been prevented. She had been decorated by generals whose names were household words and thanked personally by government officials at the highest levels. But now she was just another disabled veteran struggling to find her place in civilian life, with the added burden of being unable to claim credit for achievements that might have earned her the respect she craved. The very success of her missions, the fact that they remained classified and unacknowledged, had become her greatest curse. That afternoon, she received an unexpected visitor. Dr. Emily Chan, her former military psychiatrist, knocked on her door looking concerned. They had maintained contact since Sarah's discharge, though their sessions had officially ended months ago. "I heard about the latest denial from Classification Review," Dr. Chun said as she settled into Sarah's small living room. "I also heard about some incidents around town. How are you coping?" Sarah appreciated Dr. Chen's directness. She was one of the few people who knew the broad outlines of Sarah's true service record, though even she wasn't cleared for the operational details. "I'm managing," Sarah replied, though they both knew it was only partially true. "Some days are harder than others." Dr. Chen nodded understandingly. She had worked with numerous special operations veterans who struggled with the transition to civilian life, but Sarah's case was particularly challenging because of the classification issues surrounding her service. "Have you given any more thought to the support group I mentioned? There are other veterans dealing with similar challenges." Sarah had resisted the idea of group therapy, partly out of pride and partly out of the ingrained secrecy that had governed her military career. But the isolation was becoming harder to bear, and she was beginning to wonder if connecting with others who understood the complexities of hidden service might provide some relief. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of shouting from the street outside. Sarah looked out her window to see a crowd gathering around what appeared to be a minor traffic accident. As a trained observer, she automatically noted details: the positions of the vehicles, the behavior of the people involved, the potential for escalation. What caught her attention, however, was a figure standing apart from the crowd, watching the scene with the same analytical intensity she recognized in herself. The man was middle-aged, with graying hair and the unmistakable bearing of a career military officer. Something about him seemed familiar, though she couldn't place where she might have seen him before. As if sensing her observation, the man looked up toward her window. Their eyes met for just a moment before he turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to moving unnoticed. Dr. Chen noticed Sarah's sudden alertness. "What is it?" "Probably nothing," Sarah replied, though something about the encounter had triggered her operational instincts. "Just thought I recognized someone." After Dr. Chen left, Sarah found herself thinking about the mysterious observer. In her former life, such encounters would have been noted and reported, potential surveillance or intelligence gathering that required investigation. But she was no longer part of that world, and her instincts, however sharp they remained, no longer served any official purpose. That evening, as she was closing her curtains, Sarah noticed a black sedan parked across the street. The vehicle hadn't been there earlier, and its placement gave the occupants a clear view of her apartment building. Her training kicked in automatically, noting the license plate number and the shadows of figures inside the car. For a moment, she considered the possibility that her past was catching up with her in ways she hadn't anticipated. But then, she reminded herself that she was probably just being paranoid, a common side effect of the hypervigilance that came with her type of service. Still, as she prepared for bed, Sarah found herself checking her door locks twice and positioning herself where she could see the street from her bedroom window. Some habits, it seemed, would never fade completely. The black sedan was gone by morning, but Sarah's unease lingered as she went through her usual routine. She had spent too many years in environments where paranoia was a survival skill to easily dismiss her instincts, even when logic suggested she was overreacting. At the physical therapy clinic downtown, Sarah worked through her exercises with mechanical precision. The staff treated her professionally, but she could sense their curiosity about her background. Her prosthetic was military-grade, far more advanced than what most civilian amputees received, and her fitness level was clearly that of someone with extensive training. "You're making excellent progress," said Marcus Webb, her physical therapist, as she completed a challenging balance routine. "Your muscle memory is remarkable. Most patients with your type of injury take much longer to adapt." Marcus was a former Army medic himself, and Sarah suspected he knew more about her background than he let on. There was a professional respect in how he worked with her that suggested he understood she wasn't just another disabled veteran struggling with basic mobility. After her session, Sarah decided to stop by the local diner for lunch, something she rarely did due to the uncomfortable attention it usually brought. But her conversation with Dr. Chun had made her realize that her self-imposed isolation was becoming counterproductive. She needed to start reclaiming some normalcy in her life. The Sunrise Diner was a fixture in Fort Carson, the kind of place where local gossip was traded over coffee and pie. Sarah chose a corner booth where she could observe the room while keeping her back to the wall, another old habit that provided psychological comfort. She had barely ordered when 3 women from the neighborhood slid into the booth behind her. Their voices carried clearly in the small space, and Sarah soon realized they were discussing her. "I still can't believe she has the nerve to show her face around town," one woman said loudly enough that Sarah was clearly meant to overhear. "My husband was in the army for 20 years, and he says there's no way she did half the things people claim she did. I heard she's been trying to get some reporter to write her story," another added. "Can you imagine? Making up war stories for attention. It's disgusting." The third woman lowered her voice conspiratorially. "My cousin works at the VA office. She says Martinez gets more disability money than soldiers who lost both legs. Makes you wonder what kind of lies she told to get that kind of payment." Sarah's grip tightened on her coffee cup, but she forced herself to remain calm. The irony was that her disability payments were actually less than what she could be receiving, because accepting the full amount would have required her to disclose details about her injuries that remained classified. The conversation behind her continued, growing more creative in its speculation about her supposed deceptions. Sarah had heard variations of these theories before, each one more elaborate than the last. According to town gossip, she was alternately a fraud who had never left the country, a washout who had been kicked out of basic training, or a clerk who had invented combat stories to impress people. What none of them could know was that the truth was simultaneously more mundane and more extraordinary than anything they imagined. Sarah had indeed served in combat, but not in the conventional sense that most people understood. Her war had been fought in shadows, in places that didn't officially exist, against enemies whose names never appeared in newspapers. Her unit, officially designated as a training cadre, but actually operating under a classification so deep that most Pentagon officials didn't know it existed, had been responsible for some of the most sensitive operations in modern military history. They had prevented 3 major terrorist attacks on American soil, eliminated high-value targets in countries where the U.S. officially had no military presence, and gathered intelligence that had shaped foreign policy at the highest levels. But success in that world meant invisibility. The better they did their job, the less evidence there was that they had ever existed at all. Sarah's reflection was interrupted when her phone buzzed with an urgent message from Jim Rodriguez at the surplus store. "Need to see you ASAP. Something important came up. Can you come in this afternoon?" Curious about the urgency in his usually measured communications, Sarah finished her lunch quickly and made her way to the store. She found Jim in his office behind the main shop floor, his expression more serious than she had ever seen it. "Close the door," he said quietly. "We need to talk privately." Sarah complied, noting that Jim had pulled the blinds closed and turned on a small radio, behavior that suggested he was concerned about eavesdropping. Her operational instincts immediately went on alert. "I had an interesting visitor this morning," Jim began carefully. "A gentleman asking questions about you. He knew things about your service that most people wouldn't know." "What kind of things?" Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Jim pulled out a small notebook and consulted it carefully. "He mentioned that you had served in what he called specialized reconnaissance units. He also knew about your injury, not just that you lost a leg, but specific details about how it happened." Sarah's blood ran cold. The circumstances of her injury were classified at the highest levels, known only to a handful of people in the intelligence community. If someone was asking about those details, it meant either her security clearance was under review or something had gone seriously wrong with an operation connected to her past service. "Did he show you any identification?" she asked. "Military ID, but I couldn't get a good look at the details. He was polite, but very professional. Asked if I knew about your current activities, who you associated with, whether you had been in contact with any journalists or researchers." The pieces were falling into a pattern that Sarah recognized from her operational days. Someone was conducting a background investigation, either as part of a security review or in preparation for bringing her back into active service in some capacity. "Did he leave a name or contact information?" Jim shook his head, said if you were interested in talking, you should be at Memorial Park tomorrow at 1400 hours. Specifically mentioned that you would understand the significance of that location and time. Sarah did understand. Memorial Park was where her unit had conducted their final debrief before her medical discharge. The timing, 1400 hours, was when classified briefings traditionally began at their old facility. Someone with intimate knowledge of her service was sending a carefully coded message. "Jim," she said seriously, If anyone else comes asking questions about me, I need you to call me immediately. And don't mention this conversation to anyone." The older veteran nodded grimly. "I've been around long enough to recognize when something serious is happening. You can count on me." That evening, Sarah found herself analyzing the situation with the methodical approach that had kept her alive during her operational years. Someone from her past was reaching out, but the indirect approach suggested that whatever was happening required discretion. The fact that they were asking questions about her current activities implied that her post-discharge life was relevant to whatever they had in mind. She spent the night reviewing everything she could remember about her final missions and the circumstances of her injury. The explosion that had ended her career had occurred during a reconnaissance mission in a country that the U.S. officially denied having any military presence in. Her team had been gathering intelligence on a terrorist cell that was planning attacks on American targets. The mission had been successful in the sense that they had gathered the necessary intelligence, and the planned attacks had been prevented. But the cost had been high. 2 members of her team had been killed, and Sarah had lost her leg when their extraction vehicle had hit an improvised explosive device. The official report, heavily redacted even in classified versions, attributed the explosion to bad luck and enemy action. But Sarah had always suspected that their mission had been compromised, that someone with access to their operational details had leaked information that allowed the terrorists to set their trap. At the time, she had been too focused on her recovery and medical discharge to pursue these suspicions. The military had made it clear that asking questions about potential security breaches was not welcome, especially from someone who was already being processed out of the service. But if someone was reaching out to her now, it might mean that her suspicions had been correct and that new developments had made her knowledge relevant again. The next day dawned gray and overcast, matching Sarah's mood as she prepared for the mysterious meeting. She chose her clothing carefully, opting for items that would allow freedom of movement while still looking civilian. Old habits of operational security were reasserting themselves. Memorial Park at midday was nearly empty, with just a few joggers and dog walkers going about their routines. Sarah positioned herself on a bench with a clear view of the approaches, her back to a large oak tree that would prevent anyone from surprising her from behind. At exactly 1,400 hours, a figure approached from the parking area. Sarah recognized him immediately as the man she had seen watching the traffic accident from her window. Up close, she could see that he was indeed military, probably career officer grade, with the bearing and alertness that marked him as someone accustomed to serious responsibility. "Staff Sergeant Martinez," he said as he approached, using her former rank in a tone that suggested he still considered it current. "Thank you for coming." "I'm not Staff Sergeant anymore," Sarah replied carefully. "Haven't been for 3 years." The man smiled slightly and took a seat on the other end of the bench, maintaining a respectful distance but positioning himself where they could talk privately. "My name is Colonel James Harrison," he said, producing a military identification that confirmed his rank and showed him to be assigned to a Pentagon unit she didn't recognize. "I need to discuss some matters related to your previous service." "My previous service is classified," Sarah responded automatically. "I can't discuss operational details." "I'm not asking about operational details," Colonel Harrison said. "I'm here because some of those operations have become relevant again, and we need your help." Sarah studied his face carefully, looking for signs of deception or manipulation. Her training had included extensive work on reading people, and Colonel Harrison struck her as someone telling the truth, though clearly not the whole truth. "What kind of help?" she asked. "The type of help that might restore your good name and give you a chance to serve your country again," he replied. "But first, I need to know if you've maintained your operational readiness and whether you're still committed to the mission." The phrase "committed to the mission" was one that had special meaning in her former unit. It wasn't just about patriotism or duty. It was about willingness to operate in moral gray areas where traditional rules didn't apply, to make difficult choices that served the greater good even when they came at personal cost. "That depends on what the mission is," Sarah said. Colonel Harrison nodded approvingly. "Good answer. Before we go any further, I need to ask you some questions about your final operation. Specifically, about your suspicions regarding how your position was compromised." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. For 3 years, she had wondered if anyone else shared her doubts about the official version of what had happened. The fact that Colonel Harrison was bringing it up suggested that her instincts had been correct. I reported my concerns through proper channels, she said carefully. I was told the matter had been investigated and closed. The official investigation was closed, Colonel Harrison confirmed. But some of us continued looking into it privately. What we found has implications that go beyond your original mission. He paused and looked around the park carefully before continuing. We have evidence that suggests your team wasn't just unlucky. Someone with high-level access was providing operational intelligence to enemy forces. Your mission wasn't the only one that was compromised. The implications of what he was saying began to sink in. If there had been a systematic betrayal of classified operations, it would represent one of the most serious security breaches in modern military history. The damage to ongoing operations and the risk to personnel in the field would be incalculable. Why are you telling me this? Sarah asked. Because we think the person responsible is still active, and we need someone with your specific skill set to help us identify and stop them, Colonel Harrison replied. Someone who understands how these operations work from the inside and has a personal stake in seeing justice done. Sarah considered the offer carefully. On one level, it represented everything she had hoped for, a chance to return to meaningful service, to use her skills again, and potentially to clear her name in the process. But she had learned to be suspicious of offers that seemed too good to be true. What makes you think I'm still capable of that level of work? She asked, gesturing toward her prosthetic leg. Colonel Harrison's expression became more serious. Because losing a limb doesn't make you less intelligent, less observant, or less capable of understanding complex situations. And because the work we're talking about requires someone who can blend into civilian life while maintaining operational awareness. Someone like you. The conversation was interrupted by the appearance of two joggers who seemed to be taking an unusual interest in their bench. Colonel Harrison noticed them immediately and made a subtle hand signal that Sarah recognized as military sign language for potential surveillance. We should continue this conversation elsewhere, he said quietly. Are you interested in hearing more details? Sarah looked at the approaching joggers, then back at Colonel Harrison. For the first time in 3 years, someone was offering her a chance to be more than just a disabled veteran struggling with small-town gossip and classification restrictions. Someone was acknowledging that she still had value, that her skills and experience could serve a purpose beyond the physical therapy clinic and the grocery store. Yes, she said simply. I'm interested. The safe house was located in an unremarkable office building 30 miles from Fort Carson, disguised as a consulting firm that specialized in government contracts. Colonel Harrison led Sarah through a maze of corridors that eventually opened into a sophisticated briefing room equipped with secure communications equipment and multiple computer workstations. Welcome to Task Force Nightfall, Colonel Harrison said as they entered the room. We're a joint DoD and intelligence community unit established to investigate suspected security breaches in special operations programs. Sarah examined the room carefully, noting the high-tech equipment and the careful attention to operational security. This was clearly a serious operation with significant resources behind it, not some informal investigation being conducted on the side. How long has this unit existed? She asked. Officially? About 8 months, Colonel Harrison replied. Unofficially, some of us have been tracking these issues for over 2 years. Your case was one of the early indicators that something systematic was happening. He gestured toward a wall covered with photographs, mission timelines, and connecting strings that looked like something from a detective movie. Sarah recognized several of the mission designations, though most of the operational details had been redacted even in this secure environment. 17 operations over the past 4 years, Colonel Harrison explained. All high-priority missions involving small, elite teams. All compromised in ways that suggested enemy forces had advanced knowledge of timing, routes, or objectives. Sarah studied the display, her analytical mind automatically looking for patterns. What's the casualty count? 43 Kia, 67 wounded, including you. But the operational losses are even more significant. These missions represented years of intelligence gathering and planning. When they were compromised, we lost not just the immediate objectives, but entire networks of assets and sources. The scope of the potential betrayal was staggering. Sarah had known that her own mission had been compromised, but Seeing the pattern laid out systematically made clear that they were dealing with something far more serious than isolated incidents. "Do you have suspects?" she asked. Colonel Harrison moved to a computer workstation and brought up a series of files. "We've identified 12 individuals who had access to operational intelligence for all 17 compromised missions. Most are career intelligence officers or senior military officials with impeccable records." Sarah reviewed the list, recognizing several names from her own operational briefings. These were people she had respected and trusted, individuals whose dedication to national security had seemed unquestionable. "What makes you think I can help identify the traitor?" she asked. "Because you were there," Colonel Harrison replied. "You participated in the planning sessions, received the briefings, and observed the people involved. More importantly, you survived when your team was ambushed, which means you might have seen or heard something that others missed." He pulled up a detailed file on her final mission, including maps, personnel assignments, and timeline reconstructions. Sarah found herself reliving those last few days before the explosion that had changed her life forever. "I've been over that mission 1,000 times in my head," she said. "I reported everything I could remember during the initial debriefs." "We're not asking you to remember new details," Colonel Harrison explained. "We're asking you to reanalyze what you already know in light of what we've learned since then. Patterns that might not have been visible 3 years ago could be obvious now." Sarah spent the next several hours reviewing classified files and mission reports, feeling her operational mindset reasserting itself as she worked through the complex web of information. It was like returning to a language she hadn't spoken in years but had never really forgotten. The analysis software they provided was far more sophisticated than anything she had used during her active service, capable of cross-referencing communications, travel records, and financial transactions to identify potential patterns of suspicious activity. As the afternoon progressed, Sarah began to see connections that hadn't been apparent in the individual mission reports. The compromises weren't random. They followed a pattern that suggested the traitor was someone with advanced knowledge of when missions would be authorized and how they would be structured. "This person isn't just leaking operational details," she concluded during a break in her analysis. "They're influencing which missions get approved and how they're planned. Look at these target selections." She pointed to a series of missions that had been authorized despite questionable intelligence and significant operational risks. These missions should never have been greenlit. The risk-to-benefit ratio was completely wrong, but somehow they got approval anyway. Colonel Harrison leaned forward with interest. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking we're looking for someone high enough in the chain of command to influence mission planning, not just someone with access to briefing materials," Sarah replied. "Someone who could steer operations toward scenarios where they would be more vulnerable to compromise." This insight significantly narrowed their list of suspects, eliminating several mid-level intelligence officers who would have had access to operational details, but not the authority to influence mission planning decisions. "That leaves us with 5 primary suspects," Colonel Harrison said after they had refined their analysis. "All senior officials with sterling reputations and decades of loyal service." Sarah studied the reduced list, feeling a chill of recognition as she focused on one particular name. General Robert Blackwood had been her unit's primary liaison to the Pentagon, the man who had personally briefed them on several of their most sensitive missions. "I need to see General Blackwood's travel records," she said quietly. Colonel Harrison pulled up the requested files, and Sarah began comparing the general's movements with the timing of the compromised missions. The pattern that emerged was subtle but unmistakable. He was out of the country during the planning phases of 6 different operations, she observed. Always on official business. Always in allied nations where his presence wouldn't raise suspicions. "That could be coincidental," Colonel Harrison suggested, though his tone indicated he didn't believe it himself. "Maybe," Sarah agreed. "But look at the destinations. 3 trips to Germany, 2 to the UK, 1 to Australia. All countries with significant expatriate communities from the regions where our missions were being compromised." She continued her analysis, cross-referencing communications patterns and financial records. General Blackwood was careful, but 3 years of systematic investigation had accumulated enough data points to reveal subtle patterns of suspicious activity. "He's been receiving payments through a consulting firm based in Switzerland," Sarah discovered as she dug deeper into the financial data. Small amounts, but regular, and always timed to coincide with major operational successes by enemy forces. The evidence was circumstantial but compelling. General Blackwood had the access, the authority, and apparently the motivation to betray classified operations. But proving it would require more than financial records and travel patterns. We need operational evidence, Sarah concluded. Something that directly connects him to specific leaks. Colonel Harrison nodded. That's where we need your help. We're planning to feed him information about a fake operation and see if it gets compromised. But we need someone who can observe his reactions and behavior during the briefing process. You want me to go undercover, Sarah realized. In a sense, we want you to return to active duty temporarily, officially as a consultant on operational planning. It would give you access to the briefing sessions and allow you to observe General Blackwood without arousing suspicion. Sarah considered the proposal carefully. It would mean returning to the world she had been forced to leave, working alongside people who might recognize her from her previous service. But it would also give her a chance to help catch the person responsible for the deaths of her teammates and the compromise of operations she had risked her life to complete. What's my cover story? She asked. Simple truth with some modifications, Colonel Harrison explained. You're a disabled veteran with specialized knowledge being brought in to consult on operational security procedures. Your injury gives you a legitimate reason to be working in an advisory capacity rather than operational role. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Sarah's presence would be explained by her expertise, and her disability would account for any physical limitations that might be noticed. More importantly, General Blackwood would have no reason to suspect that she was there specifically to investigate him. Over the next week, Sarah underwent intensive preparation for her return to the classified world. Her security clearance was quietly reactivated, her consultant credentials were established, and she was briefed on the fictional operation that would serve as their test case. The fake mission was designed to be believable and significant enough that General Blackwood would want to pass the information along to his handlers, but not so important that its compromise would actually damage national security. They called it Operation Sandcastle, supposedly a joint intelligence gathering mission targeting terrorist funding networks in Eastern Europe. Sarah's role would be to attend planning meetings as a security consultant, observing General Blackwood's behavior, and looking for signs that he was memorizing details or preparing to communicate them to outside contacts. She would also monitor communications intercepts to see if information from the briefings appeared in intelligence channels that suggested enemy awareness. On the morning of her first day back in a Pentagon briefing room, Sarah found herself surprisingly nervous. She had selected her clothing carefully, choosing a professional outfit that would command respect while accommodating her prosthetic leg. Her military bearing had returned automatically as she prepared for the mission, but she wondered how she would be received by colleagues who might remember her previous service. The briefing room was exactly as she remembered it, with maps, computer displays, and the controlled chaos that characterized high-level operational planning. General Blackwood was already present when she arrived, looking every inch the dedicated military professional she had once respected. Ms. Martinez, he said warmly as Colonel Harrison introduced her. I remember your exceptional service record. It's good to have your expertise available again. Sarah managed a professional smile while studying his face for any signs of recognition beyond what her official records would have told him. General Blackwood appeared genuinely pleased to see her, but she noticed that his eyes lingered on her prosthetic leg longer than strictly necessary. As the briefing began, Sarah settled into the familiar rhythm of military planning sessions while carefully observing General Blackwood's behavior. He participated normally in the discussions, asking appropriate questions and offering tactical insights that demonstrated his extensive experience. But Sarah's trained eye began to notice subtle patterns. General Blackwood was taking more notes than the complexity of the briefing required, and he seemed particularly interested in operational timelines and communication protocols. When technical details about surveillance equipment were discussed, he asked for clarification on capabilities and limitations that wouldn't normally be relevant to his level of oversight. During a break in the session, Sarah stepped outside for fresh air and found herself approached by Major Lisa Chun, an intelligence officer she remembered from previous operations. Sarah Martinez, Major Chun said with obvious recognition. I heard rumors you might be coming back in some capacity. How are you adapting to civilian life? The question was casual enough, but something in Major Chin's tone suggested deeper interest. Sarah decided to use the opportunity to gather intelligence of her own. It's been challenging, she replied honestly. But I'm hoping this consulting work will help me feel useful again. I imagine it's difficult being unable to discuss your real service record, Major Chin observed. People don't understand what you actually accomplished. Sarah studied the other woman's face carefully. Major Chin seemed to be fishing for information about her operational history and her current psychological state. It was possible she was simply making conversation, but Sarah's instincts suggested something more purposeful. The classification restrictions are frustrating, Sarah agreed. But I understand the necessity. Major Chin nodded sympathetically. Still, it must be tempting to set the record straight sometimes, especially when people make assumptions about your service. The conversation was beginning to feel like an interrogation disguised as casual chat. Sarah wondered if Major Chun might be working with General Blackwood, either willingly or unknowingly serving as an additional source of information about personnel who might pose security risks. I've learned to let other people's opinions speak for themselves, Sarah replied diplomatically. When the briefing session resumed, Sarah noticed that Major Chin seemed to be paying particular attention to her reactions and note-taking. The possibility that she was under observation by multiple people added another layer of complexity to her mission. General Blackwood continued to display subtle signs of excessive interest in operational details, but his behavior remained within the bounds of what could be considered normal curiosity. Sarah began to understand why proving his guilt would be so challenging. He was experienced enough to avoid obvious mistakes, and his legitimate authority gave him plausible explanations for almost any level of interest in operational matters. As the day progressed, Sarah found herself settling back into the analytical mindset that had served her so well during her operational years. She was no longer just observing General Blackwood. She was studying the entire dynamic of the briefing sessions, looking for patterns of information flow and communication that might reveal how classified material was being compromised. By the end of her first day, Sarah had identified 3 potential security vulnerabilities beyond the suspected traitor. The briefing room's electronic security measures were adequate, but not perfect. The personnel security procedures had gaps that could be exploited by someone with sufficient access, and the information sharing protocols between different agencies created opportunities for unauthorized disclosure. How did it go? Colonel Harrison asked when she debriefed that evening. General Blackwood is definitely gathering more information than his role requires, Sarah reported. But he's careful enough that his behavior could be explained by legitimate interest in operational efficiency. She also reported her concerns about Major Chun and the other security vulnerabilities she had observed. Colonel Harrison listened carefully, taking notes and occasionally asking clarifying questions. We suspected there might be others involved, he said when she finished. Either willing participants or unwitting accomplices. Your observations confirm that this is more complex than a single rogue officer. What's the timeline for the test? Sarah asked. Next week we'll brief them on the supposed deployment phase of Operation Sandcastle, Colonel Harrison explained. If General Blackwood is our traitor, that's when he'll need to pass detailed information to his handlers. We'll be monitoring all communications channels and watching for any signs that the fake operation has been compromised. Sarah nodded, understanding that the next phase would be the most dangerous. If General Blackwood realized that Operation Sandcastle was a test, her cover would be blown and the entire investigation could be compromised. But if their suspicions were correct, they would finally have the evidence needed to expose a betrayal that had cost dozens of lives and untold damage to national security. As she prepared to leave the safe house, Sarah reflected on how different it felt to be back in operational mode. The constant alertness, the careful analysis of every interaction, the knowledge that lives depended on getting the details right. It was exhausting, but also energizing in a way that civilian life had never been. For the first time in 3 years, she felt like she was exactly where she belonged. The surveillance equipment hidden in Sarah's consultant badge was so sophisticated that she could barely detect its presence, even knowing it was there. As she entered the Pentagon briefing room for what Colonel Harrison had designated as the critical phase of Operation Sandcastle, Every word and gesture would be recorded and analyzed for signs that classified information was being compromised. General Blackwood arrived precisely on time, as he always did, carrying himself with the confident bearing of a career officer who had never given his subordinates reason to question his loyalty. Sarah watched him carefully as he reviewed the morning's briefing materials, noting the way his eyes moved across the documents and how long he spent on each section. "Good morning, everyone," General Blackwood began as the session started. "Today we're finalizing deployment parameters for Operation Sandcastle. As you know, this mission represents a significant opportunity to disrupt terrorist funding networks, but it also carries considerable risks." Sarah had helped design the fake operations details specifically to appeal to someone who might want to compromise it. The mission included elements that would be valuable to terrorist organizations, information about surveillance techniques, operational timelines, and the identities of intelligence assets supposedly working in the target region. As the briefing progressed, Sarah noticed that General Blackwood was asking increasingly specific questions about communication protocols and extraction procedures. His inquiries were technically within his authority, but they showed a level of interest in operational minutiae that seemed excessive for his oversight role. "General," Sarah interjected during a discussion of radio frequencies, "these communication details might be more appropriately handled through separate channels. Standard operational security would suggest limiting this information to personnel directly involved in field operations." It was a calculated risk, testing whether General Blackwood would push back against reasonable security restrictions. His reaction would reveal whether he truly needed the information for legitimate purposes. "Ms. Martinez raises a good point," General Blackwood replied smoothly. "However, my oversight responsibilities require me to understand all aspects of the operation. I assure you that all information will be handled with appropriate security measures." The response was professionally worded, but told Sarah what she needed to know. General Blackwood was prioritizing information gathering over security protocols, exactly what she would expect from someone planning to pass classified details to unauthorized recipients. During the lunch break, Sarah excused herself to make a phone call and instead slipped into a secure communication booth to contact Colonel Harrison. "He's taking the bait," she reported quietly. "His questions are becoming more focused and specific. He's definitely gathering information beyond what his role requires. We're seeing increased activity on communication channels we've been monitoring," Colonel Harrison confirmed. "Someone is preparing to make contact with outside parties. Stay alert, but don't do anything that might reveal your true purpose." Sarah returned to the afternoon briefing session with heightened awareness of everything happening around her. Major Chun was also present, and Sarah noticed that she seemed unusually attentive to the operational details being discussed. The possibility that there were multiple conspirators was becoming more likely. As the briefing reached its most sensitive phase, discussing the supposed deployment of intelligence assets in the target region, Sarah observed General Blackwood making subtle hand gestures that looked like he might be activating a recording device. The movements were so slight that they would be missed by anyone not specifically watching for them. "Let me clarify the asset deployment timeline," Sarah said, deliberately providing slightly different information than what appeared in the written briefing materials. It was a test to see if General Blackwood would notice the discrepancy and which version he would report to his handlers. General Blackwood's eyes sharpened slightly as he caught the difference between her verbal briefing and the documents, confirming that he was paying careful attention to details that could affect the success of his betrayal. The session concluded without incident, but Sarah felt the tension of knowing that the real action was just beginning. If their surveillance was correct, General Blackwood would need to communicate the gathered intelligence within the next few hours to be useful to his handlers. That evening, Sarah positioned herself in a coffee shop with a clear view of the Pentagon's visitor parking area, using her laptop to monitor the communication intercepts that Colonel Harrison's team was tracking in real time. The sophisticated surveillance network they had established could detect electronic communications within a several-mile radius of the Pentagon, looking for patterns that matched previous instances of leaked intelligence. At 8:47 p.m., their monitoring equipment detected a burst transmission from a location consistent with General Blackwood's known position. The signal was encrypted, but its timing and frequency matched patterns they had observed during previous security breaches. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message from Colonel Harrison. Got it. Moving to intercept. Stay in position and observe. 20 minutes later, Sarah watched as General Blackwood emerged from a Pentagon side entrance, walking with the purposeful stride of someone who believed his mission had been completed successfully. He had no way of knowing that his encrypted transmission had been intercepted and that teams were already moving to arrest his contacts. The next morning brought a flurry of classified activity as the investigation moved into its final phase. Sarah was asked to report to a secure briefing room, where Colonel Harrison and several other officials she didn't recognize were waiting with serious expressions. The operation was successful. Colonel Harrison began without preamble. General Blackwood's communications were intercepted and decoded. He passed detailed information about Operation Sandcastle to a contact network that we've been tracking for months. Sarah felt a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Satisfaction that their months of work had finally produced results, but sadness that someone she had once respected had betrayed everything they had all sworn to protect. What about Major Chen? She asked. Also in custody, Colonel Harrison confirmed. She was serving as Blackwood's backup communication channel and helping him identify which operations would be most valuable to compromise. The investigation revealed that she had been recruited several years ago through financial leverage, gambling debts that made her vulnerable to pressure. The scope of the betrayal was even larger than they had initially suspected. Blackwood and Chen had been part of a network that included contacts in allied nations, providing a sophisticated system for passing American intelligence to hostile forces. What happens now? Sarah asked. Justice. Colonel Harrison replied simply. Both Blackwood and Chen will face courts-martial for treason. The wider investigation will continue to identify other members of their network and assess the full scope of the damage they caused. He paused and looked at Sarah with an expression of respect that she hadn't seen directed at her in years. But, more importantly for you, this operation has demonstrated that your skills and judgment remain as sharp as ever. We have a proposition. Colonel Harrison produced a folder containing what appeared to be official military documents. Task Force Nightfall is becoming a permanent unit, focused on investigating and preventing security breaches in special operations. We'd like you to consider joining us in a civilian capacity, with appropriate compensation and recognition for your expertise. Sarah stared at the documents, hardly believing what she was reading. The position being offered was exactly what she had dreamed of during her darkest moments of isolation and self-doubt. A chance to return to meaningful service, to use her skills for purposes that mattered, and to work alongside people who understood and valued her contributions. The work would be similar to what you've been doing for the past few weeks, Colonel Harrison explained. Analysis, investigation, and occasionally operational support. Your disability would not be a limitation. In fact, your civilian status would often be an advantage for the type of work we do. Sarah thought about her apartment in Fort Carson, the whispers and mockery she faced in her daily life, and the crushing weight of being unable to defend herself against people who had no understanding of what she had sacrificed for her country. There's one condition I need to discuss, she said carefully. Name it, Colonel Harrison replied. I want permission to tell my story. Not operational details that would compromise security, but enough to set the record straight about my service. I'm tired of being treated like a fraud by people who don't know what they're talking about. Colonel Harrison exchanged glances with his colleagues before nodding. Given your role in uncovering this security breach and your willingness to return to service, I think we can arrange for some of your service record to be declassified. Enough to establish your credentials without compromising ongoing operations. 3 months later, Sarah found herself back in Fort Carson, but under very different circumstances. The local newspaper had published a carefully vetted story about her service and her role in uncovering a major security breach, complete with statements from Pentagon officials confirming her decorations and commendations. The change in how she was treated was immediate and dramatic. The same people who had whispered about her being a fraud now greeted her with respect and admiration. The mayor's office had even asked her to speak at the next Veterans Day ceremony. But the moment that mattered most came when she visited Jim Rodriguez at his surplus store. The elderly veteran looked up as she entered, and his face broke into a huge grin. Well, he said loudly enough for the other customers to hear. Look who's become a genuine American hero. Though I guess she always was one, some of us just didn't know it yet. Sarah smiled back, feeling a weight she had carried for 3 years finally lifting from her shoulders. I'm just glad the truth finally came out. Speaking of truth, Jim said with a mischievous expression, you remember those young men who were giving you trouble a few months back? They've been coming around asking if I think you'd be willing to talk to their National Guard unit about real military service. Apparently, they've developed a new appreciation for what actual soldiers go through. Sarah laughed, remembering the mockery and crude jokes those same young men had directed at her. I might be able to arrange something. I think I know some stories that would interest them. As she left the store, Sarah reflected on the strange journey that had brought her to this point. The explosion that had ended her military career had also, in an indirect way, led to her uncovering one of the most serious security breaches in recent history. Her forced retirement had given her the perspective and motivation needed to see patterns that others had missed. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Colonel Harrison. New case developing. Suspected compromise of cyber operations. Can you be in Washington Monday morning? Sarah typed back her response. On my way. She looked around Fort Carson one more time, taking in the familiar sights of the town that had been both her refuge and her prison for the past 3 years. Tomorrow she would return to the world of classified briefings and operational planning, but this time as someone whose value was recognized and whose sacrifice was acknowledged. The whispers would probably continue. Small towns had long memories, and people loved their gossip. But now the whispers would be about the disabled veteran who had helped catch a traitor, the woman who had proven that losing a leg hadn't made her any less capable of serving her country. As Sarah walked toward her car, she passed a group of teenagers hanging out near the mall entrance. One of them pointed at her and said something to his friends that made them all look in her direction. Hey, lady, one of the boys called out as she approached. Are you really that soldier who caught the spy? The one they wrote about in the newspaper? Sarah paused, remembering all the times she had been the subject of cruel gossip and mockery in this same location. Yes, she replied simply. The teenager's face lit up with obvious admiration. That's so cool. My dad's in the army, and he says what you did was incredible. Can I get a picture with you? As Sarah posed for selfies with the excited teenagers, she thought about how dramatically her life had changed. She was still disabled, still carrying the physical and emotional scars of her service, but she was no longer defined by those limitations. She was Staff Sergeant Sarah Martinez again, not in rank, but in purpose and recognition. The sun was setting over Fort Carson as she finally reached her car, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold that reminded her of sunsets she had watched in distant countries during her operational years. But this sunset felt different. It marked not an ending, but a new beginning. Her phone rang as she started the engine. The caller ID showed Dr. Emily Chun, her former psychiatrist. I saw the article in the newspaper, Dr. Chun said when Sarah answered. I wanted to call and tell you how proud I am of what you've accomplished. Thank you, Sarah replied, feeling genuinely grateful for the support she had received from one of the few people who had believed in her during her darkest period. How does it feel to have your story finally told? Dr. Chen asked. Sarah considered the question carefully as she pulled out of the parking lot and headed toward the highway that would take her back to Washington and her new mission. Like I finally got my life back, she said. As Fort Carson disappeared in her rearview mirror, Sarah thought about all the other veterans who might be struggling with similar challenges, carrying classified accomplishments they couldn't discuss, dealing with disabilities that made others underestimate their capabilities, or simply trying to find their place in a civilian world that didn't understand what they had sacrificed. Her phone buzzed with a notification that a social media post about her had been shared hundreds of times, with comments from veterans around the country sharing their own stories of hidden service and unrecognized sacrifice. Apparently, her story had resonated far beyond the borders of Fort Carson. She made a mental note to discuss with Colonel Harrison the possibility of using her new public profile to help other veterans in similar situations. If Task Force Nightfall was becoming a permanent unit, perhaps they could create opportunities for other highly skilled veterans who had been written off because of disabilities or classification restrictions. The highway stretched ahead of her, leading toward Washington and whatever new challenges awaited. But, for the first time in 3 years, Sarah felt like she was moving toward something rather than running away from something. Her radio crackled with the voice of a news announcer discussing the ongoing investigation into the spy ring that had been uncovered. Officials confirmed that the investigation is ongoing, with several more arrests expected in the coming weeks. The operation was reportedly cracked by a disabled veteran working as a consultant to military intelligence. Sarah smiled and turned up the volume. Let the whole world know that being written off and mocked hadn't made her any less capable of protecting the country she loved. Sometimes the most dangerous enemies were the ones hiding in plain sight, and sometimes the most valuable assets were the ones that others had dismissed as worthless. As she drove through the night toward her new assignment, Sarah Martinez was no longer the mocked soldier that people whispered about. She was exactly what she had always been, a warrior whose greatest battles were still ahead of her.